Marcus Ellison was 39 years old, and for 11 years he had repaired what other men broke. He drove a 2016 F-150 with 140,000 miles on it and a dent in the rear quarter panel he'd never bothered to fix. He wore steel-toed boots to work and kept a tape measure clipped to his belt, even on weekends, out of habit more than necessity. He managed facilities for a mid-sized distribution company in Charlotte, which is to say he was the man who kept the lights on, the HVAC humming, and the plumbing honest while other people took the meetings and got the credit. Co-workers called him Steady. His wife's circle of friends called him Marcus, and the way they said it, soft at the end, slightly uncertain, told him everything he needed to know about what she said when he wasn't in the room. He came home on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 hours earlier than expected, and found a stranger sitting in the leather armchair he had built himself, the one in the corner of the living room he had spent 3 weekends constructing from, reclaimed black walnut he'd hauled out of a demolished schoolhouse in Concord. The man was relaxed in it, his arm draped over the side. His shoes were still on. Marcus stood in his own doorway for 4 seconds. He did not speak. The man looked up, and in that moment something crossed his face. Not guilt, but a particular kind of confidence that told Marcus he'd been told a version of this house that did not include any real threat. He had no idea. He had no idea that the chair he was sitting in had been built by the man who owned not only the house, but the entire 8-unit building the man's own apartment was in. The building where his lease was signed in the name of an LLC, and the LLC was Marcus Ellison's. He had no idea that Marcus had known about him for 63 days. He had no idea what the next 72 hours were going to cost him. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came through the kitchen windows at an angle that Marcus had engineered deliberately. When he'd renovated the kitchen 3 years ago, he'd recalculated the casement orientation by 7 degrees to catch the early sun, and now every morning the light arrived like a slow tide across the butcher block counters he'd poured and finished himself. He'd been drinking coffee in that kitchen for 11 years. He knew the sound the third floorboard made when you stepped on it wrong. He knew the way the radiator in the hallway knocked 3 times before it settled. He knew this house the way he knew anything built right, from the foundation up. The coffee was still hot. Marcus sat with the mug cradled in both hands and watched a mockingbird work the edge of the yard. His grandmother, Claudette Ellison, had raised him in a house 4 miles from here, in the same neighborhood, in a different but similar kitchen, and she used to tell him, "Pay attention to what a man does with his hands. The rest is just talk." She had passed 12 years ago, before he'd bought the house, before he'd started the LLC, before any of it. He had wished, more than once, that she could have seen what he built. He thought she would have approved of the butcher block especially. He had met Adrienne at a fundraiser for a neighborhood youth program 9 years ago. She was wearing a yellow dress and asking pointed questions of the speaker in a way that made everyone in the room pay attention to her. Marcus had not approached her that night. He had watched her, assessed, and waited until he saw her again 2 weeks later at a hardware store on Independence Boulevard, where she was holding a paint swatch with the focus of someone making a decision that mattered. He liked that about her. He asked what she was painting. She said her dining room. He said he knew something about paint. She said she'd believe it when she saw it. He saw her every weekend for 6 months after that. She came to the house while it was still being renovated and sat on an overturned bucket and watched him work, and she had the good sense to not fill the silence with noise. He'd thought she was the right kind of person for the right kind of life. He had thought that for a long time. He was aware, now, that he had been wrong. The first sign had been small, the way it always was. A perfume on her scarf he didn't recognize, floral and expensive in a way that didn't match anything she'd have bought herself. He hadn't commented. He had filed it. That was 3 months ago. The second sign was a charge on a shared card. A restaurant in Noda he knew she'd been to on a Thursday she said was girls' night. Except Renata had texted him that same Thursday, asking if Adrienne was okay because she hadn't shown at their usual spot. He hadn't responded to Renata. He had filed that too. The third sign was a key. He found it in the pocket of her gray blazer while he was moving jackets to make room in the closet. Not a house key. Not a car key. A standard apartment key on a plain ring with no markings. He held it for 12 seconds. He placed it back exactly where he found it. He had begun, that same evening, to pay a different kind of attention. It was a notification that confirmed it. The kind you're not supposed to be able to see, because the phone was face down on the counter, but the corner of the screen lit with a name that was saved as Dana Work, and the preview read on my way up at 9:47 on a Wednesday night, when Adrienne had told Marcus she was working late at the hospital foundation where she managed donor relations. Marcus was in the hallway when it came through. He read it. He set his jaw. He went to the kitchen and refilled his coffee, and his hands did not shake. He did not wake her when she came home at 11:22. He did not ask about it the next morning. He made breakfast, kissed her cheek at the door, watched her pull out of the driveway, and then he sat down at his desk in the room off the kitchen that she called his man cave and he called his office, and he began to build the picture the way he would have built anything else, from the foundation up. His face remained perfectly calm. He pulled the last 4 months of the shared bank account statements. The charges were there, regular as a work schedule, restaurants on weekdays, a downtown hotel twice in October, a charge from a florist on the 14th that he had not received flowers from, $340 on the hotel alone, a cash withdrawal of $200 every second Friday. The pattern was clear, and it had been running for at least 5 months. What he found when he pulled the account from her personal card, the one he wasn't on, but whose statements he happened to have access to through the filing system she'd asked him to set up for her 3 years ago, told a different story. 11 months. The charges went back 11 months. He sat with that number for a moment. Then he moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He opened the property management portal for the LC, Ellison Property Group, registered in Delaware, operating in Mecklenburg County, and ran the tenant list for all 8 units in the Parkwood Avenue property. Unit 4B, leased to one Derek Vaughn, 34 years old, employed as a regional sales manager for a medical device company. Lease signed 14 months ago. Monthly rent of $1,450. No late payments. Marcus looked at the name for a long time. Then he opened a new folder on his desktop. He named it simply Parkwood. He spent the next 4 hours building the file. Statements printed. Screenshots time-stamped and saved. The hotel charge cross-referenced against a work conference Adrienne had said she attended solo. The florist charge against a date she had told him she was with her mother in Greensboro. He did not feel rage. What he felt was something much quieter, the specific clarity of a man who has found the place where the structure was undermined. He knew what to do with that. He picked up his phone and called one person. "Can you meet me Friday?" he said. "It's time to bring it all in." Patricia Lowe had been a family law attorney in Charlotte for 22 years, and she had the particular stillness of a woman who had heard everything and was no longer moved by volume. She was 61, kept her office in a building on Tryon Street, and had represented Marcus's grandmother's estate when Claudette passed. She had told Marcus, when he first came to her 6 weeks ago with a preliminary question, that she would not take his case if he was planning to be emotional about it. He told her he wasn't. She looked at him for a long moment and said she believed him. He spread the file across her desk on a Friday afternoon. Bank statements, the hotel charges, time-stamped screenshots from the property management portal showing Derek Vaughn's lease agreement, his contact information, his emergency contact, which was listed as Adrienne Ellison, with a relation listed as partner. Marcus had found that 3 days ago. He had not reacted then either. Patricia reviewed the file without looking up. When she finished, she aligned the edges of the papers and set them down and said, "North Carolina is an at-fault state. Adultery is still a fault ground. With this documentation, you will not pay alimony." She paused. "You will also want to address the joint account withdrawals, which, given the pattern and intent, could constitute marital waste." "How much?" Marcus said. "Every dollar that can be traced." That's what I needed to hear. She looked at him again with that appraising stillness. "Most men come in here wanting to burn something down," she said. "You're the first one I've had this month who brought a spreadsheet." Marcus said, "I'm a facilities man. I don't burn things. I document failures and I fix them." He drove from Patricia's office to his Uncle Gerald's house in Dorita, the house Marcus had re-roofed 2 summers ago, and where the smell of pine shavings and motor oil in the garage was as familiar to him as anything in his own home. Gerald Ellison was 71 years old, a retired machinist, and the person who had taught Marcus what a tape measure was for when Marcus was 8 years old. He was sitting on the back porch with a glass of sweet tea when Marcus came through the yard gate. Marcus sat. He told him. Gerald listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Gerald looked out at the garden for a while. Then he said, "Your grandmother told you to pay attention to what a man does with his hands. You've been paying attention. Now let your hands do the work." He set his tea down. "What did you find on the man?" Marcus opened his phone and showed him Derek Vaughn's professional profile. Sales manager. Company car included in the compensation package, a company car that turned out to be a black BMW 5 Series, which Marcus had run through the property insurance portal and found registered to a fleet account belonging to his employer. The same BMW that had been parked in front of Marcus's house twice in the last 3 weeks while Marcus was working overnight maintenance audits. Gerald looked at the photo. "He's been in your house?" He sat in my chair. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then, "You built that chair." "I know." "All right then." Gerald went inside and came back with a manila envelope. Inside was a printed email exchange, forwarded to him by Marcus's cousin Danielle, who worked in HR at the same medical device company Derek Vaughn worked for, and who had, without being asked, done some internal research after Marcus called her 2 weeks ago. Derek Vaughn had been placed on a performance improvement plan 4 weeks prior. He was 4 months behind on his car payment, on the personal vehicle he owned separate from the company car. He had filed a lease application at a newer complex 6 weeks ago and been denied due to a credit inquiry from a civil judgment in Gaston County, a small claims matter from a former landlord, unpaid, 18 months old. Marcus held the envelope. "He's not as solid as he looks," Gerald said. "No," Marcus said. "He never was." But the picture that emerged from Danielle's research ran deeper than a missed car payment. Derek Vaughn had held 3 different sales positions in the past 6 years, each at a progressively smaller territory, each departure listed as a mutual separation. The pattern a forensic accountant would recognize immediately: a man who performed well in new environments and degraded once the relationships matured. His quota attainment for the current fiscal year was at 61%. The PIP had a 60-day clock on it. His manager had documented 2 missed deadlines and 1 client complaint in the last quarter. The picture was of a man who looked like stability from the outside and was quietly failing from the inside, the structural equivalent, Marcus thought, of a load-bearing wall that had been compromised behind the drywall. Everything looked fine until you pushed on it. He photographed the documents with his phone and sent them to Patricia with a single line, "For the record only. Not for use unless I direct it." She replied 4 minutes later with a thumbs up. He drove home that evening, and Adrienne made pasta and told him about her day. He asked 2 questions. He ate. He washed the pot she'd used. She talked about a donor meeting she had scheduled for the following week, a family who wanted to fund a pediatric wing renovation, and Marcus nodded and said that sounded like meaningful work. She smiled at him. It was a real smile. That was the part that might have broken a lesser man, that she could sit across from him and smile as if the world was still the shape she'd arranged it in. He did not let it show. He washed the pot. He dried it and put it back. He went to bed when she did, and he lay there in the dark and did not move and did not speak and thought about the order of operations the same way he thought about any complex job. Sequence it correctly. Don't skip steps. Let the structure do the work. 3 days passed. By Thursday morning, Patricia had filed the initial paperwork. The serving would happen on Friday. Marcus had moved $68,000 from the joint account, the amount he had put in and could document as his contribution, into the business account of Ellison Property Group, legally, per Patricia's explicit guidance, in advance of any freeze. He had also, quietly, reviewed Derek Vaughn's lease. It was month to month past the original 12-month term. Marcus had not renewed it to a new fixed term on purpose, though Vaughn didn't know that. The notice period was 30 days. Marcus prepared the notice on his laptop on a Thursday evening while Adrienne watched television in the next room. He printed it on Ellison Property Group letterhead. He signed it. He placed it in a manila envelope and sealed it and set it on the passenger seat of his truck. Real power operated in quiet rooms. The reckoning did not happen at a lawyer's office or in a courtroom. It happened in a restaurant. Specifically, it happened at a table in the back room of a place on Central Avenue called the Ellison Room, which Adrienne had eaten at twice in the last year at events she thought were catered by a local catering group, but whose name she had apparently never looked up closely enough to notice. The restaurant had been part of Marcus's property portfolio for 4 years, leased to a chef named Raymond, who paid well and ran a tight operation. The name on the sign had always been there. Marcus had asked Raymond to set the back room for a private dinner on a Saturday evening. He had told Adrienne he was taking her to a new restaurant she would like. She arrived in a dress and heels, already performing pleasure. Patricia Lowe was seated at the table when they walked in. So was Gerald. So was Adrienne's mother, Constance, who had driven up from Columbia because Marcus had called her the week before and told her, calmly, what he had found. He had sent her 3 pages of documentation. Constance was a retired school teacher. She had been quiet on the phone for a long time and then said, "I'll be there." Adrienne stopped when she saw the room. Her expression moved through 3 phases in approximately 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, the decision to perform confusion. Marcus pulled out her chair. He sat across from her. He placed a folder on the table and left his hands flat on either side of it. He said, "I want to do this once, clearly, and then we're going to be done." He opened the folder. The bank statements went first. The hotel charges, the cash withdrawals, the florist charge on Valentine's Day. Then a printed copy of Derek Vaughn's lease for Unit 4B at Parkwood Avenue, signed by a company called Ellison Property Group, whose principal and sole owner was Marcus Jerome Ellison, seated across from her. Her eyes moved to the letterhead, then up to him. Something shifted in her face. Patricia spoke next, in the measured voice of someone billing by the hour and entirely at peace with it. She explained what marital waste meant under North Carolina law. She explained what documentation of adultery meant for the question of spousal support. She explained what Marcus had moved legally and when, and that a judge would have no difficulty understanding the arithmetic. Then Gerald placed his own envelope on the table, the one with the internal HR document, the credit judgment, the denied lease application. He didn't speak. He just placed it there. Adrienne looked at her mother. Constance looked back at her daughter with an expression that was not anger, but something worse. A patient, complete, unwavering disappointment. Adrienne tried. Marcus had expected she would. She said it wasn't what it looked like. She said she had been feeling alone. She said Marcus was never present, never emotionally available. Her voice climbed the register it climbed when she was preparing to cry. She said she still loved him. She said she had made a mistake and she could fix it. Her mother said, "Adrienne, stop." Just that. 2 words. Adrienne stopped. Marcus gathered the papers into the folder and closed it. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at her for what would be the last long moment, and he said, "I built everything in that house. The floors, the kitchen, the chair he was sitting in. I signed the lease on the building he lives in. I knew about this before he ever walked through our door, and I waited until I had everything I needed. You didn't pick a man to betray. You picked the man who already owned the building. I'm not angry. I'm clear. Those are different things." He left the folder on the table. He shook Gerald's hand. He nodded to Patricia. He looked at Constance, who gave him a single nod in return. He walked out. He did not look back. He did not look. 8 months had passed like water under the deck Marcus built the summer after everything was settled. The house was his now, clean on the title, and he had spent the better part of 3 weekends replacing the front steps with poured concrete he'd mixed himself. Dark aggregate, the kind that held its color through winter. The Japanese maple he'd planted by the walkway had taken. Its leaves were the color of old bricks. He sat on the new steps in the early morning with a mug of coffee and watched the light come across the yard the way he had always watched it, except that now the house was quiet in a way that felt like something earned rather than something missing. Jade Weston worked in structural engineering for a firm in Uptown. They had met through Patricia, who introduced them at a professional event in March, and had the good sense to say nothing more about it than that she thought they might have things to talk about. Jade had asked him at that first coffee what he was working on, and when he described the deck and the steps and the maple, she had pulled out a napkin and drawn a drainage solution for the slope on the south side that he hadn't thought through yet. And he looked at that napkin and understood something about her. She was over now, most Sunday mornings. She brought her own mug. She sat on the steps with him and did not feel the need to fill the silence. The new property group contract was signed in July, 12 units on a street in Noda, a mixed residential and light commercial space that Marcus had been watching for 2 years. The deal was worth $1.2 million in managed equity over the term, and he had structured it himself, with Patricia reviewing the language. Gerald had come by the night Marcus got the final signature, and they had sat in the same spots where Marcus had sat as a boy, and Gerald had said, "Your grandmother would have wanted to see that." Marcus said, "I know." Derek Vaughn's 30-day notice had landed on a Tuesday in October. He was out by November 1st. Marcus had heard, through Raymond at the restaurant, that Vaughn had relocated to a sublet in Gastonia and was no longer with the medical device company. The performance improvement plan had concluded with the expected result. His professional profile had gone private. The black BMW was gone. As for Adrienne, Marcus knew only what had filtered back through Constance, who had kept in quiet contact with him and who offered information only when she thought he needed to hear it. Adrienne was working now in marketing for a regional healthcare staffing company. She had moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Concord. She was managing. Her network had contracted in the way that networks always contracted, when the money and the house and the proximity to influence evaporated. The friends who had called her husband Boring Calvin without ever knowing his name, they were mostly gone. Marcus heard this. He registered it. He moved on. He was sitting on the steps on a Thursday morning in early November when Jade came through the front door with 2 mugs and sat beside him, close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them felt the need to remark on it. The maple was past peak. A few leaves drifted down and caught in the new concrete. He had built this too, not perfectly, not without cost. But he had built it the right way, from the ground up, with the right materials, on a solid foundation, in the full knowledge of what he was doing and why. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. Some things, he thought, were worth the patience to build right. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.